This is part 4 of the John highlight reel. Chapters in this part are about the second part of Holy Week, starting on Maundy Thursday, and goes after Holy Week as well. Chapter 18, the first part is Jesus' arrest and Peter's first denial. Verses 1 through 11, Jesus and his disciples go across the brook called Kidron to a garden which Judas Iscariot knew about, and so he takes a band of soldiers and officers there. Jesus asks this band of soldiers and officers who they're seeking, and when they say Jesus of Nazareth and he answers, I am he, they move back and fall over. And then this repeats itself minus the moving back and falling. Then Peter grabs a sword and cuts off the right ear of Malchus, who is a servant of the high priest. Yeah, Matthew, Mark, and Luke didn't out Peter. They just left it anonymous, but no. John had to out Peter on this. And then Jesus tells Peter to sheath his sword not because you shouldn't use a weapon in self-defense, but because this is not the time for that. Jesus' arrest is supposed to happen. It kind of needs to happen, otherwise we don't have the whole atonement thing and resurrection. So, not the time for this. Next, verses 12 through 14, the band of soldiers and officers take Jesus to Caiaphas' father-in-law, Annas, who is called the high priest, though he is more unofficially the high priest. Next, verses 15 through 18, Peter and another disciple who most think are John. I'm not entirely sure because he just says another disciple and doesn't say the disciple whom Jesus loved, which then, if it isn't John, it then makes me think it's not one of the 12 because he uses the names of the rest of the 12 like Peter. So whoever it is, don't know, doesn't matter, just Peter and another disciple follow Jesus. And then the high priest, as in Annas, knows about and who the second disciple is, whoever he is exactly, doesn't matter. So this disciple enters the courtyard with Jesus, and he tells the servant girl who's posted at the door to watch it to let Peter in. And she asks Peter if he's one of Jesus' disciples, which Peter denies. And then Peter goes and sits and warms himself by the coal fire with the servants and officers who made it. The rest of the chapter is about Jesus' so-called trial and Peter's other two denials, his second and third. Verses 19 through 24, the high priest, referring to Annas, asks Jesus about his teaching and disciples. Jesus says he's spoken openly, not in secret, so why ask him? Ask those who heard him. An officer strikes Jesus for his reply, implying that he disrespected Annas. Jesus says, well, if he was wrong, then just bear witness about it. Don't strike him over it. But if he was right, then why the heck did you hit him? And then Annas sends Jesus to Caiaphas, the official high priest, at his house. See, the reason Annas is also referred to as the high priest, even though Caiaphas is the actual official high priest for the year, is because Annas unofficially shares the title with Caiaphas, especially being his father-in-law, and officially held it for a very long time before Caiaphas, making Annas sort of the unofficial high priest. And then, meanwhile, while this is going on, back to with Peter, verses 25 through 27, those around Peter, while he's still warming himself by the fire with the soldiers, officers, and others, they ask him if he's one of Jesus' disciples. He denies it. And then one of Malchus's relatives asks Peter, didn't I see you in the garden with Jesus? Peter then denies this, and at once a rooster crows. And finally, verses 28 through 40. At this point, it is now early morning because Jesus was arrested somewhere around midnight. and he is brought to Pilate at the governor's headquarters called the Praetorium, which the Jews won't enter because it would make them unclean. Pilate, when Jesus is brought to him, tells those who brought Jesus to him to judge him themselves. They answer that they can't legally execute him, which, them saying this, is fulfilling of what Jesus said about how he will die. See, because the Jewish people themselves, their own authorities, because they are under Roman rule, cannot take into their own authority to execute someone. So Rome has to execute people. How does Rome execute people? Crucifixion. Other methods, but that is one of their top methods. And Jesus said he would be lifted up, so Pilate asks Jesus if Jesus is King of the Jews. Jesus then asks Pilate why he asks his question. Is you asking this for yourself, or what have they been telling you about me? Pilate then asks Jesus why the Jews have delivered him. Jesus says that his kingdom isn't of this world. And then after Pilate says, so you are a king, Jesus says that he was born for this purpose, the purpose to bear witness to truth which people who love it listen to him. Pilate tells those who delivered Jesus that he finds no fault in him, but he will release a prisoner as it was customary for him during that time. And he asks, all right, do you want me to then release Jesus? But nope, they cry out they want Barabbas, a robber and insurrectionist, released because he represents more of the kind of Messiah that they actually want. Chapter 19, the first part is sort of like the prep for Jesus' crucifixion. Verses 1 through 11, Pilate has Jesus flogged, and soldiers put a crown of thorns and purple robe on him and mock him by disingenuously saying, "Hail, King of the Jews." Pilate then says that he's bringing Jesus out to show that he finds no fault in him, and Jesus comes out wearing the robe and thorn crown. The officers and chief priests still say, "Crucify Jesus." Pilate tells them to go do it themselves since he finds no fault in Jesus. They say their law says he must die since he made himself the Son of God. This statement scares Pilate because, as a Roman pagan, Son of God, thinks something like demigod in his mind. He's thinking, oh heck, are the gods going to get me for getting this guy crucified? So Pilate asks Jesus where he comes from and why he doesn't answer Pilate when he has authority to release or crucify him. Jesus tells Pilate that he has no authority to do any of that. He only has the authority if it's given to him from above. So then those who deliver Jesus over to him have greater sin. Now, that doesn't mean Pilate's in the right. He has sin too, it's just them delivering Jesus to Pilate is a greater sin. Because they started this whole chain of events with that. And then verses 12 through 16. Now, after Jesus said that, Pilate starts seeking to release Jesus. But the Jewish leaders tell Pilate that if he does release Jesus, he is no friend to Caesar, since whoever calls himself a king is therefore in opposition to Caesar. So the Jewish leaders literally threaten Pilate. Then at noon in, if I say this right, Gabbatha, which is Aramaic for the stone of pavement, as Pilate sits on the judgment seat, he asks what they want to do with them, and they call for Jesus' crucifixion. Pilate asks, shall he crucify their king? And they give a very wrong reply when they answer with, Caesar's their only king. I'm sorry. I thought God was ultimately supposed to be your only king, and after him, the throne of David. Caesar is your only king? Well, that's a smack in the face of God and David, and Jesus, who's the son of both. And then Jesus is delivered over for crucifixion. The second part of the chapter, we actually get to Jesus' crucifixion. Verses 17 through 27, Jesus carries his cross to Golgotha, which is Aramaic for place of the skull, and is crucified there between two men. His charge, King of the Jews, is inscribed in the three most common languages of the area, Aramaic, Latin, and Greek, over his head. Chief priests don't like that being put over his head, so they ask Pilate to change it, at least to something like, well, he claimed to be. Don't make it sound like he actually was. But Pilate says, nope, that's what he put. That's Jesus' charge. That's what's staying up. And soldiers who crucify Jesus divide up his clothes and gamble over his tunic because it is seamless and they don't want to rip it, fulfilling Psalm 22:18. Jesus' aunt, his mom Mary, Mary Magdalene, and Clopas' wife Mary, so many Marys, stand by the cross. Which, by the way, if you don't know who Clopas is, he is one of the two disciples talking with Jesus on the road to Emmaus, which you can read about in the last chapter of Luke. And then something that people often overlook, but has significance, Jesus puts John in charge of caring for his mother. You see, traditionally, at this time period, when the mother became quite old, especially if the husband was gone, so Joseph's probably died by this point, she would be taken care of by her eldest son. Well, this is Jesus, but crucifixion and his soon ascension after the resurrection gotta kind of keep him from being able to do that. So it would pass on to the next oldest son. Well, that's Jesus' brother James. But Jesus says, nope, my disciple John, I pick you. I am putting you in charge of the responsibility of taking care of my mother. Wow, what an honor. You can imagine that. And there are many reasons as to why Jesus specifically chose John, but I think one of them is that John is one of the few of the 12 that will live long enough to be able to take care of Mary. I mean, even Jesus' brother James gets martyred. Next, verses 28 through 30, Jesus says he thirsts, saying this to fulfill scripture, is offered sour wine in a sponge on a hyssop branch / reed, which the wine is sour according to Matthew because it was mixed with gall. And then Jesus says, it is finished. Or the word finished can also be translated as paid. So it is paid, referring to the sin debt. Christ has paid the sin debt in full. And then he dies, his divine spirit separates from his human body. And then verses 31 through 37, the Jews ask Pilate to have the crucifixion victims die now so that they don't stay like that during the Sabbath, which is the very next day. Today is the day of preparation, a Friday. And so, because how crucifixion works is that the upper body is forced to hold itself up until it can no more and then drops and essentially internally collapses, the soldiers break the legs of the men on each side of Jesus so that their upper half drops and sort of speeds up the process of crucifixion. But they do not break Jesus' legs, since he is already dead, fulfilling Psalm 34:20. Then Jesus' side is pierced by a spear, fulfilling Zechariah 12:10. And something very interesting that John points out seems pretty strange is that what we know today as pericardial effusion and, if I say this right, pleural effusion comes out of Jesus, which John calls blood and water. Now, these are fluids that build up around the heart and around the lung, respectively, when the human body has gone under as much trauma as Jesus has, and under that kind of trauma. So, this fluid coming out of Jesus when he's stabbed with the spear, which will have had to have gone through his lung and into his heart, prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that, yeah, he died on that cross. No doubt. And if you still want to say that the actual crucifixion didn't kill him, then, all right, the spear killed him. Either way, while he was on the cross, he died. The swoon theory, the theory that he never really died on the cross and was alive the whole time, it cannot possibly be true according to this eyewitness account, according to these medical facts. This is just one of the many things that make the swoon theory impossible. I have an article linked in the description that you can look at and learn all the various reasons why the swoon theory cannot be true. Then the third and final part of the chapter is Jesus' burial, verses 38 to 42. Jesus' secret disciple, Joseph of Arimathea, secret because he didn't want the Pharisees to know about it, asks Pilate for Jesus' body, which Pilate gives him. Nicodemus brings 100 litras, which is roughly around 72 pounds, or for you non-Americans, roughly around 32.7 kilograms, mixture of aloes and myrrh, which is a burial spice. Hence one of the reasons the wise men gave it to Jesus when he was a kid. One, it was costly, so it could be sold for money, and two, it was a symbol of his future sacrifice. Then Jesus' body is wrapped in linen cloth, as custom to the Jews, and put in a fresh tomb in a garden near Golgotha, and then the tomb is closed. Chapter 12, the first part, is about Jesus' resurrection and his first two appearances. Verses 1 through 10, early Sunday, which is the first day of the week. I know a lot of people think it's Monday, but no, it is Sunday. While it's still dark, Mary Magdalene and others who John didn't feel necessary to include comes to the tomb, finding the stone moved. She goes and tells Peter, and who John calls the other disciple, that someone has moved Jesus' body and she doesn't know where. Now, who particularly the other disciple is, not really certain. A lot of people think it's John, I think possibly, but since he didn't use the disciple whom Jesus loved, I'm not so certain about it being him. And since he didn't use a name, if it's not him, then it's most likely not one of the 12, since he uses the other 12's names, like Peter. But again, it doesn't matter. Well, they run to the tomb, which John apparently feels the need to put that the other disciple outran Peter, which honestly kind of makes you think it is John. That, and he's either boasting about himself or just really is a jerk to Peter, like with that and calling him out on cutting off Malchus's right ear. Either way, again, doesn't matter. They get to the tomb, so they're the disciple first, and both find that the tomb is empty, that the body is not there, but the body cloth is lying there, and the face cloth is there, and not just laying there, but folded up laying there, which, if you're just stealing the body, why would you bother doing all that, and why would you want to touch the dead body directly? You know? So the two find that no one's home, and they go back to their homes. But Mary Magdalene stays there. And verses 11 through 18, while she is still there weeping over not being able to find Jesus' body, an angel appears and asks her, "Why are you crying?" And she says, "Someone's taken Jesus' body and I don't know where it is." Then Jesus, who is doing something supernatural to prevent Mary from being able to recognize him, making her think that he's the gardener, asks her, like the angel, "Why are you crying?" And she tells him, if he took Jesus' body, just tell her where it is. Where'd you hide the body? And then when Jesus says her name, she recognizes him and calls him Rabboni, however you pronounce it, the Aramaic word for teacher. Jesus tells her not to cling to him in a metaphorical sense because he has yet to ascend to the Father, and tells her that, no, don't be clinging to me right now. Go and tell the disciples about him resurrected, which she does. And then verses 19 through 23.
Later that same evening,
In a locked room, Jesus appears before the disciples. So he basically literally teleported in. And he shows his wounds to them, gladdening them, because they're like, oh yeah, it definitely is you. It's not some spirit. And Jesus also tells them that he is sending them as the Father sent him, and he breathes on them, saying, receive the Holy Spirit. And any sins they forgive are forgiven, and any forgiveness they withhold is withheld. Now, this doesn't mean every believer then automatically has the magic power to decide who does and doesn't get forgiven, or that even the apostles have this power. But this is just in reference to them ministering on behalf of Christ through the Holy Spirit. The rest of the chapter, we get poor Tom and the purpose of this book. Verses 24 through 29, Thomas wasn't with the other disciples when Jesus first appeared. So he says, no, I'm not going to believe you till I put my fingers in his hand wounds and my hand in his side wound. Then 8 days later, Jesus appears to the disciples again, but this time Thomas is there. And Thomas is told by Jesus to do exactly what he said. Put his hand in Jesus' side wound and his fingers in his hand wounds. Then Thomas calls Jesus his Lord and his God, which Jesus does not say, no, don't call me God. Wonder why? Because he is. And then Jesus does not necessarily reprimand Thomas, which is why it's not fair that Thomas is known as Doubting Thomas, even though Peter literally denied Jesus 3 times. Where's denying Peter? No, Jesus does not necessarily reprimand Thomas, but says, oh, so you believe now that you have seen. Well, blessed are those who believe yet haven't seen, as in Jesus resurrected. Like Christians now, none of us today have seen Jesus resurrected in the flesh, except for those who claim visions of him. So, believing in something you haven't seen directly, that's not blind faith, but it is stronger faith. And so, blessed for it. And then finally, verses 30 and 31, Jesus is said to have done many more miracles in the disciples' presence than the ones that are actually written in John's Gospel account. But what is written in John's Gospel account is written so that one can believe Jesus is Christ and God's Son. And so one can believe that one can have life in Jesus' name by believing. It doesn't say by believing and doing good works. It just says by believing. Not because good works are unnecessary, but because that is by which you receive salvation only. Hence why John only mentions it. Last chapter, chapter 21, the first part is about Jesus appearing to 7 disciples. Verses 1 through 14, Peter, Thomas, Nathanael, aka Bartholomew, from Cana, Galilee, brothers James and John, and 2 other disciples, who may or may not be of the 12, get into a boat, Peter's idea, to fish, but they catch nothing by nighttime. At daybreak, Jesus stands on the shore, asks them if they caught anything, and then when they say no, he tells them they'll find fish if they cast their net on the right side of the boat. John then says that it's Jesus to Peter, who then throws on his outer garment and, like his coat, and runs out through the water, which they're around 100 yards out, to Jesus, with the others following behind in the boat because they didn't want to get wet, dragging the net full of fish. And on land, they find bread and a charcoal fire with fish on it. Jesus tells them to bring some fish they've caught. Peter hauls the huge, surprisingly untorn net full of 153 fish ashore. Jesus tells them to have breakfast. They don't ask who he is because they all know who he is. He's not supernaturally disguising himself. He physically gives them bread and fish. And this is Jesus' now 3rd time appearing to the disciples. So these 7, it wasn't just a fluke. These 7 have seen him on 3 separate occasions now. The rest of the chapter is about how Peter and John end. Verses 15 through 19, after they finish eating breakfast, Jesus asks Peter 3 times if Peter loves him. Each time, Peter answers yes, answering grievously the 3rd time with, "You know that I love you." And after each of Peter's answers, Jesus tells Peter to feed/tend his sheep. And the reason Jesus asks 3 times is because it's to restore Peter of his denials. 3 "Do you love me?" yeses, to restore 3 "Do you know him?" no denials. Jesus then tells Peter that he dressed himself and went where he wanted to when he was young, but now someone else will dress him and another will take him where he doesn't want to go. And John says that this refers to how Peter will be martyred. Now, a lot of people think Peter was crucified upside down. They think this is how he was martyred. However, Jesus said someone else will dress you. For crucifixion, the victim is stripped, so this doesn't make sense. Plus, the tradition of believing Peter was crucified didn't come till hundreds of years later anyways, and him being crucified upside down came even longer after that. Peter's friend, Clement, who is said to be one of the first 4 popes, he wrote in his epistle, 1 Clement, that Peter died in AD 64. During AD 64 was the Great Fire of Rome, under Emperor Nero's reign. And during it, Emperor Nero used Christians as scapegoats so he wouldn't be blamed for the fire, and had many of them executed, according to Tacitus, a Roman historian who lived in the generation after Nero. And also, according to Tacitus, how Christians were executed during this time was via 3 major ways. One was crucifixion, second was being mauled by animals, and the third was being made into human torches. Well, when it comes to the being mauled by animals execution, Tacitus wrote that how this was done is the victims were covered in wild beast skins and so that dogs would tear them apart. Remember, Jesus said, "Someone else will dress you." So this is actually most likely how Peter was martyred, which may or may not be worse than being crucified upside down, since being crucified upside down will be better probably than being crucified right side up, since the blood would rush to your head and knock you out. But I don't know, and I'd prefer to not find out the hard way. Moving on. Next, verses 20 through 23. Peter then looks at John after being told how he's going to die and asks Jesus, hey, what about him? What about John? Peter says, what does it matter? Jesus says to Peter, what does it matter to him if Jesus wills for John to live till Jesus returns? Which John points out that this leads to a rumor of people thinking, hey, John won't die then. This is what that means. But he clears up the rumor and says, no, it just means John's fate is irrelevant to Peter's. He's got his own martyrdom to worry about. He doesn't need to worry about when or how John's gonna die. Irrelevant. And finally, verses 24 through 25, John identifies the author, which is himself, as the disciple whom Jesus loved, and says that this testimony of his is known to be true. And he says, we know it to be true, so him and multiple. And he says that if everything Jesus did was written down, everything that was and wasn't written down, if it was all written down, then hyperbolically the world could not contain the amount of books that would be. Now in this video with the key verse from each chapter, 1837, then Pilate said to him, so you are a king? Jesus answered, you say I am a king. For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice. 1930. When Jesus had received the sour wine, he said, it is finished. And he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. 2029. Jesus said to him, have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. And finally, 21-24. This is the disciple who is bearing witness about these things and who has written these things, and we know that his testimony is true.